Welcome for those who are joining us. I can see some participants still coming in. My name is Olivier Krischer. I'm the Acting Director here at the University of Sydney's China Studies Centre. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the last of our events for the Sydney Asian Art Series of 2020, now in its fourth year. I'd like to first of all acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land, the Indigenous owners of the land on which the university is built. I'm today sitting in our Camperdown campus, and this is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to, on behalf of all of us here, pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. It's very important work of custodianship and education that's happened for thousands of years, and I think it's very fitting to recognise that for our discussion today as well. It's my pleasure to be here to introduce our panel. First of all, I'd like to thank the partners that make this possible. So this series is a collaboration between the China Studies Centre, the Power Institute here at the University of Sydney, as well as the Art Gallery New South Wales, and Viz Asia. And particularly here for our last event of the year, I'd really like to acknowledge the support, particularly of Viz Asia, that's been able to bring so many fascinating speakers, practitioners into the conversation of Asian art broadly in Sydney. This year, of course, we've had to move online, and that's actually been, in some ways, it's been fantastic because we get to facilitate conversations like the one that we're having tonight or today. The theme this year has been art and technology, so that's also quite a good reason, I guess, to be joined online in this way. But we've had such an amazing experience to hear 4 lectures from as diverse as ink painting in 1960s China, Japanese copperplate reproductions in 1880s Shanghai, through to just a few days ago, a lecture on moving image in contemporary Hong Kong, both cinema and video practices. And of course, we have a fascinating lecture by Rahaab Allana, who joins us today again as a moderator on South Asian photo media practices and curation. And that lecture is now online on the Power website. So if you missed it, I suggest checking that out as well. We are very lucky to have Rahaab back. He has curated, as it were, a panel entitled Revisioning the Present, for which he's invited 3 practitioners to share a work of art, an artifact, a poem or inscription, any object that embodies for them a source of knowledge about our past and future, which inscribes a moment that should live on, as he wrote, and become a source of inspiration. So I won't say more than that about the framing of the panel. It's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Rahaab Allana is a curator and publisher at the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts in New Delhi, and has curated, contributed to and edited many publications and exhibitions on South Asian photography, its transnational histories, both in India and around the world. He is the founding manager and managing editor of PIX, P-I-X, a theme-based photography initiative, and is currently guest editing a volume for Aperture magazine. And on our panel this evening, we are really delighted to be joined by Ruhanie Perera, by Indu Anthony, and also Diwas Raja KC. So Ruhanie is a performer, lecturer based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. She works at the Department of English at the University of Colombo and is a founding member of the performance collective Floating Space. In 2009, she completed her MA in Performance and Culture at Goldsmiths, and that's really shaped the research foci of her practice, which is storytelling, communities and lived experience in performance, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about this evening. Diwas Raja KC joins us as the head of research and archives at the Nepal Picture Library, which does amazing work. And his own work has been focused on engendering a research-based approach to art, archival and curatorial practices. His curatorial show and book entitled Dalit, A Quest for Dignity explored ways of witnessing Dalit pasts in Nepal, and his co-curated exhibition, The Public Life of Women, from 2018, monumentalized feminist pasts in Nepal as an intervention in public memory. And finally, Indu Anthony is an artist from Kerala, who's now based and joining us from Bangalore. She works in multiple mediums, which we'll hear about this evening, of which photography is a core element, but also in performance and installation. She often works with ideas questioning societal confinement, identity, gender, public access, collective and suppressed memories. And this is a modest introduction to what actually is a long list of exhibitions and projects, which I encourage you to find out more about as well. So before handing over to our moderator, I'll just say one thing about housekeeping. One of the benefits of the webinar format is that you can post questions at any time. So I encourage you to do so, and we'll have time after the individual presentations to deal with questions from the Q&A window. I'll now hand over to Rahaab. It's great to have you back, and thank you very much again for putting this conversation together, and thanks to all our speakers.
Thank you, Olivier. It's really a pleasure to be back. I would like to also thank and acknowledge our panelists, as well as the audience who is gradually coming in. It's been really a pleasure for me to have this interaction with you over a broad span of time for several months now. And hence, I would like to, of course, acknowledge Bizasia, the Power Institute, Sydney University, but also particularly Olivier and Nick, who have really shepherded me through this process. I hope to see you all in person at some point of time and visit your institutions as well. And 2021 might actually present that possibility. As I was writing the introduction, which I will gradually read, I did notice last night as I was scrolling through the news that the Australian Centre for Photography might be closing very soon. It struck me as a pertinent point to bring up, especially during this panel, which is revisioning. And though I don't know the finer details of it, it seems like an important point to sort of just volunteer at this moment. I also want to wish a happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Today is the 26th. And so I will continue from there. With today's panel, which asks or suggests a revisioning, the very notion, I think, is also an acknowledgement of the subconscious terrain in which practices might migrate space, discursive, methodological, and real, and hence are positioned to survive in history, as the nature of all objects is perhaps hybrid. This is arguable, of course, but I say this with reference also to the broad canvas that South Asia presents us with. And if one may imagine it, a layered impasto of experiences that always makes us question, if not imagine, its place in the future. If we accept this montage or assimilation, and these assimilations which are then periodically teased, especially from work, and I don't only mean works of art, but the metadata of research, we can also accept how non-conformity is now inscribed within practices and processes, and eventually in performances, if not objects. One of the outlying concerns of this panel could then be about deliberating how to regenerate, how to relive, and scrutinize the ephemeral, the moment, not only the object, and plausibly even question how preservation may arrive with structures of imbalance that can be carried on into the future. And hence, though the panel comes with great idealism in terms of what one might do with revisioning the present, there are cautionary tales embedded within them. And so as a further provocation, and while thinking about, let's say, the complicated or troubled or imperfect or contingent legacies of what is left behind, what are the conditions that operate within bodies of work that in fact make them live on? I recently revisited this publication, and I'll just quickly share my screen. Can everyone see the screen? Yeah? Okay. So I recently revisited this object, which is a book titled The Subjective Object, and it manifested of its own how there can never be a ruling singularity that conditions how and why any phenomena, and in this case, the field of ethnography, can be strategized and displayed for future generations. And one of its key theorizations rests around the idea that the decisions we make, either to show or not to show material, and the ways in which narrative trajectories unfurl, often are not synchronized with the object's making. And that actually presents a moment at which the viewer is far removed from that object. And in this book, there is also presented the work, among other South Asian artists, of Brian Jungen, a Swiss artist who is living in British Columbia. And his work was titled Prototypes of a New Understanding, wherein after visits to several museums in Manhattan, he came upon the glitzy Nike town and decided to interpret an iconic symbol of British Columbia through new materials, shoes found in the market, once again playing on the very notion of global capitalism and its effect even on a specific cultural history today. Questions of indigeneity, perhaps, one of the key vectors of this panel, as Olivier mentioned, and its persuasions, its message today, and its manifestation. One of the key scenarios his work presents us with was how our politics and their social mandates or imperatives find personal, institutional, and if demanded, anti-establishment outlays through the recursion of creative strategies and the repetition of images that, from becoming iconic in the past, start becoming uncertain symbols in the future, especially in a world in which media of all kinds, static, performed, moving, have become self-generating operators, and some more privileged and dominant than others. And so revisioning the present is not a necessity. It is perhaps inevitable at any given moment in time. Will the adjustment that comes with new frameworks, the return always to a new center, present and mandate more distributed systems through which ideas might permeate? What will be the place of our collective enterprises that are bound perhaps only by their contemporaneity when they set themselves free from any one given context? By everything a generation undoes and the vacuum it can always threaten to leave behind, perhaps the absences, maybe even the erasures, how can one today crystallize one's links with a repository, that sort of empty shelf space on our counter, by giving primacy to an unknowable phenomenon through objects, let us say, that might hide in plain sight? How can our investigation change the course of the present? I ask this because, after all, an emotional afterlife that even in the current populist reconfigurations of a collective conscious that is erupting across the world, it asks us, through our allegiances, through our affiliations and our entitlements, not only as subjects, but as the book presents, as subjective objects, what exactly do we demand to be acknowledged today? Will we self-consciously be able to provide a revisionist counterstructure to our own dominance in any narrative is also a question. How at each point in history can we and should we embody an uncertain visibility, a ghost to reinforce practice? Does the pedagogy that comes with such open-endedness disable the specificities of place, of geography, of regionality, so far that it does also condition and make us aware of a troubled relationship we might have with image making today, with constructions of images today? What they mean to us consciously and otherwise, and where they might end up countering their own narratives. This is the tension that the panel can perhaps present. The ask of each speaker then today is for you to volunteer propositions for what may speak beyond a time, right? Of this time, and to seek that. To seek ontology, perhaps over ideology, of being over belonging. The lexicon of identity is complicated in our present, and perhaps a lot may be lost in the overdetermination of meaning, and perhaps this gives reason for letting poetic register and dissonance to enter the fray, the performing of now. The subjective object then alerts us of another questionable parameter, the negative and the positive, which is innate to the making of images on celluloid. The publication subtly asks why we consider that which is beyond our knowledge and experience the so-called negative. And then once experienced, the sharing of that, only the positive possibility that exists engaging experiences. How can we, on the other hand, productively use the shared intelligence that may itself be indefinite in the end? Because perhaps in the end, there are just ideas reenacted and enacted over time. One of the examples that I have cited more of late is, of course, Bertolt Brecht's War Primer. And I had the privilege of seeing this with some colleagues earlier on in the year. And what it presents to us is the impossibility of making sense and the perversity of statement making at all times. Perhaps the perverse does have a great deal of power in the present, and perhaps, as cited in the book, there is a performative deformation, even as mentioned by Homi Bhabha, the need for parody, the need for ideas to last, and the objects that might embody those parodies over time. And while we think about how media practices generally offer themselves in multiple formats, along multiple axes, and enable different dialogues and transfers, perhaps we may also imagine all that lies in the future is a convergence, a fragile yet insistent slippage that can as much be demonstrated through an act, through a whisper, or through an artifact of the everyday. And so with this brief introduction, I would like to invite our first panelist, Indu Antony, to make her presentation, followed by Ruhanie Perera and Diwas Raja, following which we will have some questions which I will moderate and engage a discussion with. So without further delay, Indu, I leave it to you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Rahaab, Olivier, Nicholas, the Sydney University Power Institute for having me as a part of these conversations, and also Diwas Raja and Ruhanie Perera for taking their time and being part of this wonderful panel. So I'll just share my screen. Sorry. Just, are you able to see it? Is it visible now? Okay. So I would like to start my presentation. First, I would like to acknowledge my late grandmother, Selina Lonapin, for just being the energy that she is, and also to acknowledge the All India strike that's happening today in India. So the title of the presentation is Life of Objects, and it is kind of a take of Arjun Appadurai's book, which talks about the social life of objects. So going to the next slide, this also starts the presentation with, there was a lot of reading of this book by Sherry Turkle from her book Evocative Objects, where we think with the objects we love and we love the objects we think with. Artifacts, mementos, souvenirs, heirlooms, personal keepsakes, or functional objects and material culture in domestic spaces can play an important role in remembrance, emotional dynamics, and processes of identity formation for individuals, families, and communities. In context of mobility, relocation, migration, and forcible displacement, such objects can represent links with home, loved ones, and the autobiographical past, providing a sense of identity and its continuation. Frances Yates, in her work, The Art of Memory, describes an early attempt to create a physical space to enable the reliable recollection of knowledge by architect Giulio Camillo, who made very interesting thing called the memory theater. This was an imaginary building thought of as comprising various rooms and areas, each containing mnemonic objects and features that symbolize particular ideas, which can be visualized mentally as a systemic method of remembering those ideas, such as more like the memory box that I will be talking further. The memory theater provided a space in which an individual could embody their memories, solidify them by placing them in specific places, cementing them in the mind. Physical containers of memories manifest as museums or national memorials, art galleries, attics, domestic display cabinets, and keepsake box that I'm going to talk about. Mihaly and Rauschenberg use the concept of cultivation to understand how individuals foster relationships with objects in their book, The Meaning of Things. The same culturally legitimized object might provide only a fleeting comfort to one person, whereas to another, it signified complex emotional and cognitive ties. Thus, we concluded that the potential significance of things is realized in a process of actively cultivating a world of meaning, which both reflect and help create the ultimate goal of one's existence. I would like to mostly talk about this one body of work that I did called Why Can't Brass Have Buttons, which was an autobiographical book which talks strongly with, it's an object-based autobiographical book which talks about the strong sense of identity and who I am. The pandemic threw me and most people into uncharted territories. Since I lived by myself, the feeling of isolation was quite heightened. I am privileged to have a roof over my head and feel safe. But from trying to make sense about my surrounding, the key was to stay calm and also present. But the sense of touch was something that was very much missed. So I desperately started growing plants. I desperately started cleaning cupboards. I started looking at old archives. And then I discovered this Orma petties. Orma petty in Malayalam, it translates to English as memory boxes. And I started looking at each of these objects and how the tactile sense of each of these objects brought back certain memories to me. Yeah. The image on the left is the Giulio Camillo's memory theater and talking about the sense of touch. So I started, this is a box of different kind of objects that is used as a memory game in one of the senior homes. I started looking at objects and started taking each of these objects from my boxes and started stitching them with a single strand of hair. Now, this image shows, I'll talk about how I was, growing up in a migrant community in Dubai. Materials and objects were very relevant to our identity. My father was among the first few who decided to explore Persia, as it was called back then, from this tiny village in Kerala. He soon made Dubai his home, got married, and soon after, me and my sister were born. Ever since I remember, the annual trip to Kerala was eagerly looked forward to. This means shopping for foreign goods for relatives and villagers back home. There was this ceremonial suitcase packing where the neighbors in Dubai helped us pack the suitcases, and which was weighed to the exact last grams. This suitcase would arrive in this village, mostly on top of an ambassador car, and later there would be a day fixed to open the suitcase. On this day, the relatives and villagers would be called, and this suitcase opened to reveal different foreign objects, like soaps, shampoos, radios, toys, chocolates, etc. This would then be the talk of the town for the next few days. Yeah, this is like an image from one of the films that was made around this. And these are the, I remember these trips to India every year. These objects are not consciously selected containers of memories that must be preserved as a lasting symbol, displayed or safeguarded in a protected space. But they are utilitarian items that acquire mnemonic function over time. One could analyze such objects anthropologically from the perspective of gift giving, the special relationship and bond that the gift creates between the giver and the receiver, and the anticipation of reciprocal exchange. In this context of migration, people feel a deep attachment to the real home, and social and kin relationships are constantly maintained through phone calls, messages, and return visits. The gift is another key in staying connected to home across time and space. This annual ceremony left a strong impact within. During this exercise, I never had my share of objects and my special suitcase. So I started collecting these objects from a very, very young age. And then, of course, it grew a lot, and I still collect some of them. And during the process of this project, it was important to then take these objects and stitch them with a single strand of hair. So this is the book that came out of it. It is called Why Can't Brass Have Buttons? And each object, that in this book in particular, there are 37 objects with a certain dialogue of memory that is also, I'll talk about a few of these objects. Yeah, I'll talk about one of the like 3 to 4 objects from the book. The first one is a negative film of Amma, my mother. Amma always says, don't hang photos on the wall. Only photos of dead people are hung on the wall. This is a horseshoe that I had collected from a trip with my father to Ooty. I went with my father to horse ride, only to then realize I was sitting on a donkey. It was in Ooty. This is a cloth piece. The only thing I could grab was a piece of her shirt as she jumped out of the car. I tried making a miniature family of dolls, and then it kept altering and changing the members, and eventually the steel spatula became my third cousin. I had to abandon this chore. It's a miniature doll person. This is 13 emerald beads. He pulled my necklace and 13 beads fell. From here, I also want to talk about how there are these, from the book Biographical Objects by Janet Hoskin, where she talks about, very interestingly, how she explains about how a life which is caught in the process in a beetle bag, and how people have differential ways of explaining between a biographical object and a physical commodity. At a temporal level, the biographical object grows old and may become worn and tattered along the lifespan of its owner, while the public commodity is eternally youthful and not used up but replaced. At the spatial level, the biographical object limits the concrete space of its owner and sinks its root deeply into the soil. It anchors the owner to a particular time and place. The public commodity, on the other hand, is everywhere and nowhere, making not a personal experience, but a purchasing opportunity. And how, for me, there has been so much of overlaps of, there was no distinction, but in this project, these personal, commodities, as she speaks about, and the biographical object kind of crossed over. One of the interesting aspects also is the language that I kind of used in this book. It is like Michael Reddy's conduit metaphor, which is referring to language as containers. I will, yeah, just, I don't know if I can play it, but I'll play a little bit about the book. It was very important for me to kind of not have a spine for the book, because these are memories that occur at different time, and I didn't want to have a chronological order, because they come and go. Some are repressed, they would have come at a different time. So hence it was very important to kind of not have a spine to kind of bind the book. The material also which was used for the book is this Kora cloth, which is used to, kind of pack parcels in the railway stations. So yeah, I think I'll end with this video, and also a small note by Michael Reddy's, him explaining about the conduit metaphor, which is basically ideas or meanings are objects. Linguistic expressions are containers. Communication is sending. The speaker puts ideas, in bracket objects, into words, in bracket containers, and sends them, in bracket along a conduit, to a hearer who takes the idea, objects, out of the word, containers. The video continues. I'm just skipping through to keep time. Okay, that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indu. And it just struck me as you were showing your publication, is that there's so many contexts that are embedded within that one publication. And maybe in our discussion, we can talk about not only the different contexts, but also how you eventually decided to make it into a publication, because it strikes me so much like a piece that can be performed as well. And I know you engage with performance, but maybe that's for a little later. And just so that we carry on to the next speaker, whose main craft is performance, Ruhanie, maybe you can lead us into yours.
Thank you, Rahaab, and thank you, Indu, for that. I think it gives us also a lot of things to think about, and I'm really happy for coming on the end of you. I also just wanted to thank the Power Institute and Nicholas and Olivier for kind of bringing us together, or creating a context for us to come together like this. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, sorry. So when I heard the word revisioning, it took me back to a piece of writing by Adrienne Rich. First published in 1972, the essay is titled When We Dead Awaken, Writing as Revision, or she writes it Revision. So I retitled my presentation to say, or to borrow from Adrienne Rich, who borrowed from Henrik Ibsen, When We Did Awaken. So it references in turn the play When We Did Awaken by Henrik Ibsen, that is about a woman's awakening to the use to which her life has been put in the hands of a playwright. The text also gives me a definition for revision, the act of looking back, she says. And for me, that doesn't have to be measured in time. Of seeing with fresh eyes, she says. For me to see again and again through the same lens with different questions. Of entering an old text from a new critical direction is for us more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. I like to think of the critical question as an act of survival, because then we have no choice but to ask it. I want her words to speak to my question: how do we conceive of an ethical sensibility when working with the bodies of women as written in and through performance? And for that reason, I use her poetry. And I think my contribution, as much as I'm talking about a performance work, my contribution is to think through this amalgamation of texts that help me reflect, I think, on this critical question. The poem is titled Planetarium, but these particular lines I'm interested in. I'm an instrument in the shape of a woman, trying to translate pulsations into images for the relief of the body and the reconstruction of the mind. So I'm kind of, what you're seeing is the middle, or the middle of a performance. And if there is time, maybe, and if it can be played, we can look at it later, but I will talk through it so we have a sense of what these images might mean. But I use this particularly because in this presentation, I am positioning the image as embodied actions or performative acts that are produced in performance. This is rooted in my work as a performer and my interest in the performing body and its relationship to story, more specifically the autobiographical work. How is autobiography embodied, creatively produced, and represented? I say this very consciously, as the problematic of representation for me haunts the work we do in the theater, in performance. So what you see here is very simple. It's a series of photographic documentations of a live performance. And I'm not doing anything, really. What is happening is that I'm just manipulating my face with my hands. And what you see, what are produced in that moment. The only thing I do prior to this is to adorn the body with a series of objects. And that's all that makes up this 5-minute performance. Its title is Somewhere Between Truth and Its Telling. It's a 2-part work, first performed as a standalone work in other performances and curated art, dance, academic platforms. But now it makes up the research and an archived performance in the form of a video work that is somehow held together, all of it somehow held together by this title. I wanted to title the work, as well as my writing on the work since, Somewhere Between. I wanted to try and capture the sensations that I experienced as a performer, of both discomfort and conviction. I was trying to find a place from which to speak. Why was that so difficult? What is it about this meeting place, where lived experience comes to reside in an act of creative revision, that feels so contested? It's partly accidental, I think, but the methodological anguish, I think, is what also is somehow there in the imagery that you're looking at. What, or rather, where was the loss? Had I taken on the story of a woman only to lose her in performance? There are many archives that make up Somewhere Between, there's a different performance making process that preceded it. The year 2011 that saw post-war resettlement in the north of my country. The historicity of experiencing violence in the country, a landscape, a place, an emotion, loss. I'm being purposefully abstract. In the last 12 years of doing and redoing this performance, its archive feels far away. And I feel the need to contend with its inherent repertoire. Performance theorist Diana Taylor writes that performance also constitutes the methodological lens. And so performance also functions as an epistemology, embodied practice along with and bound up with other cultural practices offer us a way of knowing. So this is the slide on which I'm going to play the performance. So that's why it's all black. So what does this performance contribute as a way of knowing? It supports critical thought or a reflection on the body as the body moves from theater to the archive, and a different mobility, I think, the body acquired by virtue of its archived form. Since December 2019 to August 2020, this performance was a part of the exhibition 100,000 Small Tales. It straddled a 3-month lockdown. Within this curatorial vision, the work sat within a very specific narrative of art history and in conversation with other contemporary artists and the discipline of collective thought. Women artists, visual artists working with objects, forms of performance art and photography. This is the room that it was sitting in. And if you look towards the table, the objects are displayed on the table. What I'm really using with this photograph for is for a sense of context and the larger gallery that it sits within. Yes, there are women artists, visual artists working with objects, different forms of performance, performance art, photography, photo performance, questions around the self, and questions around the self as historically produced, as creatively expressed, and an interiority. They were interestingly all held together within the word, and this was the curatorial provocation, self/portrait. Now, seeing my work outside of myself and within this kind of curatorial proposition, disembodied in some ways, helped me to finally articulate what I feel like is the complex process of exchange that takes place when working as a performer with autobiography, constructing autobiography. Crippled, and this is not an overstatement, crippled by questions of ethical considerations as my specific burden, I had found myself inarticulate. I thought it would be interesting to look at just these 3 objects that I use in the performance, in the recorded performance that I wear, in the live performances that I wear, to piece together the face of a woman. Now, I want to go back to this idea of the self as historically produced, as creatively expressed, as interiority. And I want to go back to the idea of the complex process of exchange that takes place when we work with and through autobiography. On this table, on the extreme right, is a little tin of kumkuma, right? It is the red dust that is kind of placed on the forehead. And it's a very specific, for me, performative act, but it is also an embodied identity. It is the body of a woman, a body of a Tamil woman in the country, in some ways my other, quote unquote. And so when I use this, I am acutely aware of the historicity of that object and all the circulating kind of narratives that sit around the fact that I invoke this, that has its own history of systemic and just sort of systemic and narrative violence also, but very specifically violence placed on the body in the kind of culture of erasure as well, with women having to erase this identity marker off of their foreheads. So I'm aware that that sits on the table and that sits on my body, and I invoke the gesture. And as I put this woman together, I then draw from my mother, because that's her slide, and the bangles of my grandmother. So it becomes this really complex process where there is autobiography in these many forms and many shapes that one draws upon to connect, to create, to kind of work with the poetic image that one is creating and the narratives that one is kind of also sitting amidst. And interestingly for me, this came from a place of feeling inarticulate. And so I keep going back to this question: how do we imagine a sensibility for ethics in practice, in performance, in relation to the body, in relation to objects and their materiality, and work with these confines of narrative, of representation? And so I think through words, and I think for me sometimes these questions are interesting, and I piece together what this ethical sensibility is I pieced it together, I think, first in words. And what I found interesting was to go back to these old questions: who is speaking, who is listening, whose body is in view and whose is not, what is being represented, how and with what effect, who or what is in control. Tied to that, another question or another thought. Sorry, I can't see the full extent of my screen. Oof. It is one thing for a woman to tell her own story. I think I have it somewhere in my notes. It's quite another for it to be told for her. What I like here is while one cannot assume that the first narration is necessarily more true than the other. And I think that was the place of my struggle. I constantly thought invested in someone else's life. And my taking of it, that was more true. And then where was I placed or displaced in relation to what was more or less true? Certainly that conversation of the exploitative potential comes up, but I'm interested now in that being a methodological concern that we arrive with through performance. So for me then, the ethical sensibility somehow must propel a struggle within the body and with the body, where you confront the body that is not yours anymore and its materiality as estranged from your intention for it. One must allow the body to refuse you. Because knowing that it exists to be read, sometimes the body does refuse to speak. For me, that's where the inquiry begins. And I think what we do in the studio, in the rehearsal sometimes, is to dig deeper into what sensibilities that failure might produce. And so I think that's where my methodological question is, and to try and think through the ways in which we make work with that methodology sort of embodied in the process, and then the work speaks as a methodological kind of concern as much as it does as a performance. I'm just going to leave it there. I don't know if the video would work in this forum, so should we just come back to it if at all, if we need to?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Ruhanie, for that insight into your work, which also speaks, to a great extent into methodology and as well as practice. And I think the sort of lines that get fused between the two, which I found extremely compelling. Things that, of course, strike me immediately are questions of autobiography and representation, especially the latter. And sort of what are the disembodied ways in which you encounter yourself, and what that sort of has resulted in vis-a-vis the performance itself. Something that I take directly away from your work, in a sense, was what you began with, the question of survival. And I was always interested in this question of whether sometimes objects, ideas surviving history itself is substantial enough to be a critique in the future, rather than always enacting upon those. Survival itself has the power of a resistance. And in this case, I would like to sort of go to our last speaker, Diwas, and his sort of questions regarding research and methodological concerns with respect to, of course, indigeneity, ethnography, and an array of curatorial practice that surrounds it. So Diwas, I leave it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rahaab, first of all, for inviting me and the rest of us today. I want to thank both Indu and Ruhanie first for your excellent company today. And it's going to be a very tall task for me to come after your very thought-provoking presentations. I would also like to thank Nicholas, Olivier, and Power Institute for having us here today. So let me start by introducing the artifact that I will be working on today. So this is a picture of a DDT spray that one of our researchers took during a recent research trip from a place where we had been working on an archival project on indigenous histories in Nepal. The project, which we had called Indigenous Past, Sustainable Futures, sought to create an archive for the Anthropocene, so to speak, hoping to record the accounts of lands and peoples that had been ravaged for the construction of a modern developmental nation state. I mean, we are very much aware that the destruction of indigenous landscapes and life forms that have happened at much grander and devastating scales in other parts of the world. The violent dispossessions through mining, intensification of productions, and resource extractions for capitalist accumulation, which have disproportionately affected the world's indigenous populations, have in some ways skipped Nepal. One might say this is the benefit of being underdeveloped or of remaining in the outer orbit of capitalism's centripetal forces. After the Second World War, the agents of modernization who turned to Asia as the next ground for industrial growth clearly didn't see Nepal as having the conditions for a capitalist takeoff. So if you compare the aid dispensations to Nepal, for instance, with other East Asian countries, you see that. So what Nepal received in terms of, has received in terms of bilateral assistance for the last several decades was mainly in the form of technological support and transfer of equipment. But the experience of indigenous communities in countries like Nepal reveals something that is hard to capture through the narratives of spectacular violence and the dramas of deep ecological and geological time collapsing due to global warming, which today very reasonably determine our notions of the future. Some of the most insidious violence of our times are what Rob Nixon has called slow violence, where the causes and effects of modernity's violence are temporarily dispersed and spatially distanced in a way that suppressing the accounts or suppressing the accounting of violence within the scales of lived experience. They quite often translate for indigenous communities as a feeling of being out of place in their own land, of being dislocated without even having moved. One's own landscapes no longer sustain memories and stories that once generated investment in and frames of reference for placemaking. The DDT, of course, was a gift of the mid-20th century, which I have already alluded to. DDT was a great success story of the Second World War itself, a weapon for disease control that eventually inspired the World Health Organization to launch its vaunting scheme of gaining complete victory over malaria and the Anopheles mosquito population. Such heady ambitions of total control over nature and warlike approach to managing diseases were important legacies of the 20th century. I've stolen this map from the internet so we can be familiarized with the area of concern. The flatlands, which you'll see in green here, the southern belt of Nepal, which we call Terai, was a notorious hotbed for malaria. In the olden days, no one dared even travel through the dense forests that covered this entire region during the summer months, let alone imagine living there. Except the various and scattered indigenous communities, generally referred to as Tharus, who had for centuries devised unique patterns of life adapted to the malarial forest landscape. DDT and the eradication of malaria enabled Kathmandu's technocrats and their international allies to visualize the Terai belt as underutilized by the native Tharus, and where wholly novel spectacles of progress and modernity, cultivation and productivity could thus be staged. The construction of roads and land policies that distributed newly cleared forest lands to politically dominant and hegemonic groups of Nepalis from the northern hills were principal elements of this vision. Hill farmers were thought to be more hardworking, skilled, and espousing of the productive spirit that suited the developmental regime, unlike the indigenous populations. So essentially, what has happened is something we could call an internal settler colonialism. DDT was, of course, eventually banned. By the 1980s, DDT had already ruined the soils, the rivers, and the bodies exposed to it for indigenous communities in Nepal, but I would think surely in other parts of the world too. The heavy use of DDT had also permanently changed their equation with their lands and the forests. Meanwhile, the global campaign against malarial mosquitoes all but failed. Not only were the Anopheles mosquitoes able to acquire resistance to DDT, but also the viral chains between humans and mosquitoes proved far too complex. Experts, even today, continue to debate which type of pesticides are good and which bad. But what remains close to debate is the supposed need for limitless growth and intensification of our productions. And to suggest that the injunction to modernize is untenable, that it sets all of us to abandon sustainable attachments to land and attention to the well-being of the earth, is dismissed as erring and irrational, unrealistic, primitive, and obscurantist position. So if we could switch to Olivia's screen, Olivia, if you could come in here. So we've produced an online exhibition based on this project. Thanks, Olivia. So we've produced an online exhibition on from this project, which will be running on the screen while I continue speaking. Hopefully you'll look at this at leisure at a later point. But for now, it might give you a sense of the work as well as the context for what I'm describing. The DDT canister that I showed at the beginning used to be a potent symbol of progress and modernity in the Tharu context. Even till a few decades ago, you could have found those canisters in every household, reminding natives and settlers alike that life and survival was no longer possible without the constant churning, transforming, and remaking of the land. Today, these DDT canisters can scarcely be found. The villagers who dug one up for the purpose of our exhibition remarked that the canister should be sent to a museum where it can be viewed as a relic of the past. DDT was, of course, not the only object that was transforming the indigenous landscape in Nepal. I think this history is possible to be charted through the production and distribution of several other materials. The ones that at least we were keen to pursue were kerosene, electricity, bitumen, petroleum, and many other petrochemical byproducts like paints, dyes, and detergents, whose appeal to us probably had to do with the way these materials were supplying viscosity as the new sort of dominant and ever-growing form for encountering matter in the industrial and post-industrial age. You could picture this, the new landscape in terms of the flows and resistances, seepages and slippages of new viscous materials. And you'll see that in the exhibition too. Kerosene particularly is interesting for us because, like DDT, it has now largely disappeared from use. But until not very long ago, kerosene was the key fuel that illuminated rural Nepal before widespread electrification had occurred. So we were sort of interested in this idea of the old new, or technologies that were once new but have become old now. So the diminution of indigenous life forms is a history of sacrificing certain people for the purpose of gaining acceleration towards a certain vision of the future. We know this well. And the acceleration happens quite literally through some of the same viscous matters I mentioned above. The matters that operate locomotives and expressways, matters that have collapsed distances and transfigured our experience of time and space, that also sustain the flows of labor and commodities across the divisions of centers and peripheries. All of this has ruptured entire sensoriums of living, surviving, and thriving as irrelevant to the future of this planet. All of this we also know is the foundation on which the homogeneous time and space of the nation state is constructed. To belong to a nation thus means participating in a shared, synchronous, and coeval flow of time from the past to the future, as many scholars have also pointed out, defined by the categories, interests, and perceptions of settler discourses. Natives are invited or forced into accepting the non-native temporal and spatial project. But really the settler or non-native temporal orientation and spatial occupancy only underwrites indigenous peoples like the Tharus as vanishing people, whose persistence in the present time gets characterized as vestigial and anachronistic. The erasure of Tharus, of the Tharu people from the flow of time itself means they need not be consulted for decisions about the present and contemporary life or considered as stakeholders in the future. But I want to return to that moment where the Tharu villages brought out that canister for us to view, that canister of DDT, slowly accumulating rust and patina. And they described it as a relic of the past. Not that the impacts of this particular technology are no longer felt in the contemporary world, nor has the vision of the world that enabled the pouring of DDT across the forests of southern Nepal really disappeared. But beyond the loss of homes and life worlds, beyond the humiliations doled out by settler and modernizing projects, is there an indigenous future already conceivable beyond the vaunting ambitions of progress? As a thought exercise, pursuing Rahab's invitation or provocation to revise our very sense of the way time is unfolding, I wish to think that when we witness these new technologies turning old, as we witness development turning into dystopia, we realize how utterly contingent the timeline of modernity or the march of progress is, which we are told is the only way of experiencing time. There is a concept in science fiction called uchronia, referring to hypothetical, fictional, or alternative timelines of history. And indigenous artists themselves are also turning quite prominently in recent years to speculative science fiction in the form of indigenous futurism, much like Afrofuturism. Alessandro Portelli is a historian who has this remarkable essay called Uchronic Dreams, where he describes Italian communists who look back at history and pinpoint precise moments when things went wrong and things could have been very different. One learns then to affirm and identify with not the present as it really exists, but with a different, a more desirable present that we have been cheated of by the sheer accident of history. Such uchronic identification with the present that we deserved but we do not have are not pure fantasies. I think they shape actual actions that are taken in the real world, as the actions we take in the real world. They preserve links to a different future despite the undesirability of our present. So I will close today with this thought, perhaps wishing upon all of us that may our uchronic fabulations free us from the timeline that all of us are trapped in, and may the long traditions of indigenous struggles and resistances to preserve themselves beyond what is increasingly seeming like the end of the world, may that be our inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Diwas, for that riveting presentation, I have to say, and full of possibility. I want to sort of get into some of the questions I have before I open it up for discussion. And I'll do so because we have only approximately 10 minutes left. What struck me throughout The Skin of Chitwan, which is an extraordinary curation, so thank you for sharing that with us, it reminded me of another exhibition in a different way entirely, which was, of course, in place that I had seen in Cambridge called Another India. You might have seen the catalogue for it done by Mark Elliott many years ago, where he had also, in a way, engaged with so-called indigenous communities in India, and eventually also commissioned new works from them, as in they were responding to their environment now. So it sort of also had the tenor of becoming an exhibition with a certain aesthetic and an art practice. I wanted to ask you this question with respect to the curation of Skin of Chitwan. It has such a definite aesthetic, a visual aesthetic that has been generated either through the archive or through contemporary image making and video. And I wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about what that aesthetic impulse was in order to generate the curation. Because of the sort of political and subtle lines that engage with questions of survival and identity culture of indigenous communities is so distinct and complicated right now. What were some of the complications of its aesthetic tenor that you were sort of dealing with? I'll just leave that as a question. So after you.
Oh, should I answer first, or you want to go through?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Rahaab, for the question. I mean, I haven't looked at the curation that you mentioned, but please do share me the link. I would love to check out the work that you mentioned. I think for us, the archive is always the reference from which we work, and it's always the goal for much of our work is always archive building. That really shapes our curatorial, our research practices here at Nepal Picture Library. And I think for this one also, I think there were a lot of concerns about how do we represent a history like this, a history whose documentations are actually not extant or existing, but whose histories have to be sort of suggested or drawn out of materials that are not typical in the sense of what a historical research entails. What I mean is in the absence of an actual archive. So I think the practice for us, at least for this exhibition, for this research, has always been about how can we sort of cull in more and more materials or as archival. And I think one of the inspiration for us has really been about trying to see, and I think I really see similar inspiration in the work of Indu and Ruhanie as well, where we can see if we can draw very complex histories from looking at the flows of materials and of objects and materials. And I think one of the first sort of guidelines for us was that, is there a way, given that so much of this the past and the records of the indigenous people have been lost to us, is there a way if we can look at the flow of, for example, kerosene and bitumen, those kind of material whose sort of intervention into these spaces have really been the source of great transformation of these spaces and lives. If there is a way in which we can build a history by actually looking and following these objects. And kerosene, we found, has a really interesting sort of entanglements with the Tharu community. Because we found that Tharu communities are one of them who draw tattoos. There are tattoo making people. They build very intricate tattoos on their bodies, and we found that at some point they had started using kerosene as opposed to mustard-based oil that was traditional. They had started using at least some of them. Some Tharus had started using kerosene to build their tattoos, and so that became so just looking at the sort of these flows. Allowed us to sort of chart a different kind of history, or chart the history through a different sort of means. That was one concern. And I think the second concern that has really informed us for this, to address the aesthetics that you are pointing at, I think it's really been to us about how do we move away from a sort of framing that is almost always in a context of countries like ours, is about representation and identity. And because the project is also about the Anthropocene, it's about climate change and these massive sort of transformation, the world, and all of us are facing, we wanted to take a slightly non-anthropocentric approach to it, which meant perhaps in a difficult or problematic way, actually decentering Tharus as well from the history that we were sort of making about Tharus. So you'll notice in the exhibition, you actually don't see Tharu faces, you see them mostly from back of, from behind. That's got us in some trouble here because it can register as sort of negating the presence and representation of these marginalized people. But we really wanted to tell a story about the landscape, actually. It's really a history of the landscape and people's entanglement with the land. So I would say that's what the aesthetic behind the curation was.
Thank you. No, that sort of outlines in a way many of the outskirts of the subjects that we have coming center forward in this discussion. I would find it curious to see this in a way, or the sort of maneuverability of it, because it's so in a way spontaneously maneuvered, in a sense organically maneuvered online. As one scrolls down and things emerge and sort of the discussion unravels over time, it's extremely directive also in a way. But to see that perhaps what manifestation that might take in a space, in a physical space in time would be interesting for me. And as you mentioned, as you mentioned, the stretch of time and the sort of elongation and elasticity of it. One of the things, Ruhanie, that struck me with regard to your presentation, and it reminded me rather of, was this publication called the Sentient Archive by Bill Bissell and Linda Haviland. And in that, it sort of says that the body itself is a work of art, given it presents a nexus of meanings. And I noticed that, as you were talking about the performance itself, there was also this question, as you mentioned, of methodology playing out as you did the performance. But I wanted to ask, in already doing that performance, what were the sort of challenges that you saw of its enactment in space, and whether there had been multiple enactments of the same performance that had occurred, and what were the sort of convergences and dissonances that you saw? Only to ask, I suppose, the question, how does one create, and of course this has been a big question with regard to performance, how does one create one singularity that the archive so-called proposes, which is actually very indefinite? And on the other hand, an impossible task when it comes to the idea of creating enactments. So maybe some of the challenges there that were presented to you. And I saw that, of course, you gave the image of the exhibition space, which again comes with its definition and its sort of, sanctity, as it were. But of course, the performance being a way of decentering that entirely or recentering. So please.
Thanks, Rahab. That's sort of a big question, but I think where I should start might be to say that I wanted purposefully to not be specific about the performance that preceded somewhere between, because because of this thing that I felt like at some point this experiment has to kind of let its archive go. But I think to understand what is undone or what is the disembodied that is there in somewhere in between is to think about how making happened in a very particular kind of representational form in a theater context, in a performance called My Other History that we created as a company, and that was written and directed by my colleague, Jay Koloff. What that did was to kind of create a story of a family or a context of displacement that was experienced in Sri Lanka from the perspective of different people who, we encountered in the performance making process. So story kind of just narrative just kind of entered into that process of performance making. And what I had I found myself having to do in this very specific, and that's why I said representation sometimes haunts us, in this very specific representational mode, was to draw on this kind of singularity of person that in some ways was gifted to me by a person, by a lived experience. But I was pulling on these identity markers. You know, I was pulling on a very specific color when I picked the sari for it. I was picking a very specific ritual of cooking. I was making food on stage, and it was a very specific kind of food. I was, you know, researching gold, like to see, because gold also has a very particular kind of place in our histories in terms of what it constitutes, not just as memory, but also what it constitutes as economy and mobility. And so, you know, piecing together these bits of gold to kind of make a woman, I felt I was drawing on that idea of the circulating, but very sort of sense of singularity. And I think when I was performing, what I constantly found myself was this inability. So I have my script, I have my text, and I can't get the character, I can't bring the character to bear in that moment. And that was I think the point of break. And I think the challenge in somewhere between was trying to figure out what the hell it was. Because it was this tiny 5-minute little thing that I was now doing as a theater artist that had no space or no context to live in. It was just the residual of something that I was kind of only carrying forward, the 5 objects and the manipulation of my face, right? And to kind of understand, I mean, I performed it from 2012 to 2000 and kind of about 17, 18, in so many different contexts and so many different conversations. It felt like it could only live in this kind of place where we were cerebrally kind of going to take it apart and engage with it, because that felt like that. And, you know, you also wonder then what is your relationship as a performer to the thing that you're creating. And that's why I said when it became this video work, it kind of acquired a different mobility, because I found its ability to live outside of me. And that was another way of thinking through. And I think that's where my awareness of its possibility to exist also in the methodological concern emerged. And in the whole time that I did it, I always sort of went through this thing of what is the right context for it? How do I control the audience for it? How do I control the effect of it? How do I control? And it was to understand that I couldn't, and I just had to kind of lay bare all I had, which was this body and 5 objects in trying to, and it was an attempt to relate to these objects outside a different singularity, I think, that had held them together.
Thank you. No, I pick up on the very idea of play here, because, you know, at any given point of time, I suppose what one embeds with that, or what one can embed with that, is constant deferral, constant sort of engagement, but also the diffusion of moments in order to recreate, new ones as one proceeds. And of course, when I come to the work now of Indu's, one of the things that struck me, Indu, was the object itself. As you were talking about the project, as you were talking about identity, autobiography, but also the disembodied experience, what you eventually managed to do is create this sort of artifact, as it were, something of artifactual value, let's call it that. While so much of it, for me, was about thinking about the passive, the power of silence. And maybe some of that comes out also through this one-on-one engagement with the book. You know, as one turns the pages, one reads sort of through it. But coming back to this notion of both the passive and the playful, I wanted to know about the production of this work as both tuned into one, because it strikes me also as you're looking at your past and you're looking at these objects, but you're also thinking in terms of, the playful character of how it unfurls your history. And maybe the challenges of doing that, of autobiography becoming playful. If you could just highlight some aspects of that.
Thank you, Rahab, for the question. I think to start off, I remember my mother very clearly telling that, well, there's no need to keep these really stupid things in your box, and I was like, no, Amma, for me, this is like the things that I really like. And she's like, what values a stone? And she would always try to like not understand my play as a, I would call it as like, oh, this is my thing of like, favorite way of collecting. At the same time, holding on to a certain incident which my parents wouldn't understand, or holding on to something that people around wouldn't really, make sense of. So I think that's where it all started, like this whole thing of like, oh, this is my tiny box of things. I didn't have a Barbie doll or like a doll house or any of those things, but this was my play. And to also further like understand, these are like really, really random objects, and it's all found in somewhere, or something would have happened, and then I would like just keep them. So it became fun to kind of like take, emotional, some of the objects were very emotional, but at the same time for me, it was then to do the whole act of stitching it with a single strand of my hair to have another layer of meditative process of doing this, and also the text that accompanies it is not really a description, but in a way a fun dialogue, or a fun, a small little excerpt of a memory. So I think that's how, I went about the whole project. And also it made sense during this pandemic. It happened very, very recent. It was in March or April where I took it up, and I said, okay, I'm feeling like very anxious. There's nothing around. What do I do? And then I came upon these objects, and it had like a multitude of emotions, but to actually like then stitch each of them was like important, and in a way for me to have this sense of tactileness,
Thank you, Indu, for that. Though we now have run out of time, I really appreciate you bringing up the current moment that we're in, of course, which has also been iterated or reiterated as a paradigm shifter, for all of us. And I suppose what I really appreciate about these projects is also the way that one will have to articulate them in the current context, and maybe the context itself has changed the way in which not only the way in which we describe them, but the way in which we actually perform them in the future to come. One of the things also that struck me, or rather invoked, as I was looking at your bodies of work yesterday, was a poem, in fact. And for some reason, as one sort of comes about this subject of revisioning the present, this one particular poem struck out, and in a way it had to do with the question of language and setting oneself free of it, but also then reinventing a new one, which may or may not have allegiances to the past, which may or may not have a kind of tethering even to the present, but then again it brings to light the tenuous nature of the future. Of course, it is a poem by Nizar Kabani, whose work I've been exposed to more in the recent past than before, but I'll quickly read it out before, I suppose, handing it over to Olivier to conclude. And he says this, it's just about 5 or 6 lines. I conquer the world with words. I conquer the mother tongue, verbs, nouns, and syntax. I sweep away the beginnings of things. And with a new language that has the music of water and the message of fire, I light the coming of age and stop time in your eyes and wipe away the line that separates time from the single moment. So that's Kabani for you. And with that, I would like to conclude our session. I want to thank Ruhanie, Diwas, Indu for your extraordinary presentations. And as they have been recorded, just to mention for the public, they will be available in time for you to view in the event that you did not make it. But without further ado, I would like to now invoke the spirit of Olivier to rise from behind the screen and take center stage. Olivier, to you.
Thank you so much, Rahab. It's been really a privilege, I think, to learn more about your practices, and I think I really want to actually congratulate Rahab for bringing the panel together, because it was a very open, creative, generous introduction, and yet the thread of works and practices is something that I thought was amazing, and particularly for me, the relationship between the subjective objects, the idea of subjectivity, of the speculative, the performance of the now, these sorts of, it's all sort of resonating. And I guess to end on a positive note, I couldn't help but think of a really different valence or currency to the idea of post-truth. You know, for many of us, that is a really negative and, you know, such a dismal kind of reality. And yet in all of your practices, I thought that's a really different take on something that is different to the truth, that it's not enough. There's an ethical sort of urgency, which is something that I've taken away from each of your presentations, which says something very positive about the creative act, I think, and creative agency. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again, thank our audience, and say I'm sorry that we can't go on, because the conversation, I think, could be very rich to continue, but it's been really a pleasure. So thank you very much again.